Hey, what's up guys? Today we're going to be talking about the top 5 most underrated units in Genshin Impact. I'm going to talk about the strongest characters you guys probably aren't using, or at least that are underrated in the meta right now that a lot of other content creators, tier lists, all that stuff just tend to place very low, and I want to explain some untapped potential in those characters and some reasons why they might be better than a lot of people think. Do keep in mind a few things though. Number one, what I believe is underrated and what you believe is underrated might change. You know, obviously everyone rates characters differently, but I'm going to cover the characters that I see underrated the most. Also, while I'm mainly naming 5 characters, I will include some honorable mentions because it was hard to pick just 5 because there's a lot of characters that have some potential that aren't really fully used or fully understood right now. I also want to add that I made a video like this about 4 months ago, and so I'm mainly not going to be talking about characters that I mentioned previously, except one of the characters actually that I mentioned previously but that I want to touch on again for different reasons. Before I begin, I want you guys to know that I stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested. Be sure to sub if you're new, and let's go. So the first character I want to talk about might come as a surprise, but it's actually Chongyun. While Chongyun isn't the strongest character in the game by any means, he has a lot of utility that I feel is underplayed. There's actually a few cryo characters that I want to talk about today, partly because the element is so good, but also because a lot of these characters have amazing kits. While Chongyun's damage isn't as high as other cryo characters, he offers an insane amount of cryo application through his field, which makes him especially good against something like the Abyss Herald, an enemy that's been present in every recent Abyss that has a very tanky and annoying shield if you don't have fast cryo application, and someone like Chongyun is a support that you can slap in literally any team to destroy this shield very easily. Chongyun's biggest strengths though are actually a lot of his passives. One of his passive talents will give you 8% attack speed for characters inside the field that are sword, claymore, or polearm users. This is a very nice quality of life that can be good with characters like Shoutout or freeze teams with like Kaya or many other DPSs. The biggest thing about Chongyun's kit that I really like though is actually his second constellation, which I know not everyone has, but it's absolutely amazing. This 15% cooldown reduction to any elemental skill or burst cast inside of his field is huge, and honestly not a lot of people talk about this. While I do think Chongyun at C0 is also pretty underrated and deserving of the spot, his C2 is definitely a huge power spike and one of the reasons why I have to talk about him. On top of that, his elemental burst is pretty good, the scaling is quite high, and it does hit 3 or 4 times depending. With Constellation 6 it does hit a 4th time, and it can reverse melt or freeze enemies, which are both amazing reactions. Chongyun can be great in freeze teams, which I will talk about later in the video, and are very good. They're some of the best teams in the game for virtually any content except against enemies that can't be frozen. Unfortunately, some enemies in floor 12 like the Magu Kenki and the Array are very annoying for freeze teams because you can't perma-freeze them, but for every other floor and chamber, freeze teams are amazing, and even like reverse melt teams can work as well, so he's not only good for freezing. That being said, being able to run the Blizzard Slayer set, the 4-piece, on all your characters, gaining 40% crit rate when you attack an enemy that's frozen, and cryo damage bonus is really good, and Chongyun is someone who can enable that. And so overall, a lot of people I see put him in very low tiers on their tier list, and the fact that he's cryo and has so much utility and can fit many niche comps and enable many niche comps, even something like a cryo Kaching and many others that I mentioned previously, makes me believe that he is honestly very underrated for all those reasons. Next up, I want to talk about a character that might surprise you honestly, but I think that kind of proves that they're underrated if you're not expecting this character here, and that is Barbara. The reason I have to talk about Barbara is partly because of how good Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers is, but also because she's a free-to-play healer who offers enough healing to keep you up while also giving you other perks that people don't really mention and tend to really underrate this character by placing them in very low tiers in their tier list. While she's not the absolute best healer, since she is a free-to-play option who heals more than enough when you invest into her, even in places like the current floor 11, she also provides you with, you know, a lot of useful things that I'm going to cover. First of all, Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers is a free-to-play weapon that gives you 48% attack to whichever carry you're running. This is especially good with characters who can snapshot to fully utilize this burst, carries like Beidou, Shangling, or just hyper carries in general like Xiao. Being a healer with Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, and obviously a free-to-play option, is enough to make a character be viable. Even if this character offered nothing else, the fact that they could give attack with this weapon and be your healer slot makes them a pretty good option. However, that is not all. On top of that, if you do have enough healing on your artifacts alone, you can run her on Noblesse Oblige, and while her uptime on this set isn't amazing, it is enough to where this 20% attack is something to mention. On top of that, she can be a pretty decent hydro applier. While her hydro application isn't as good as someone like Xingqiu or Child, especially as a free-to-play option or as a secondary option for your second team that needs hydro, since it is a very overpowered and widely used element, Barbara can be pretty decent at it. As you can see from the footage on screen, my team comp, I'm running a quick swap freeze team team can perma-freeze enemies just off of Barbara being the only Hydro applier. Her elemental skill, applying Hydro from off-field, is more than enough to allow my team to perma-freeze the enemies and deal the most damage they can with like the Blizzard Strayer set and just all the advantages of a freeze comp. And obviously, while their Hydro application isn't as fast as some of the characters I named earlier, it is an okay amount, while she's also a healer with Thrilling Tales and a free-to-play option. And I feel like a lot of people tend to just dismiss this character and only talk about the negatives, like, yeah, sure, other characters might heal a bit more, and yes, it can be annoying that her elemental skill can apply wet to you, which usually doesn't matter, but can be annoying against certain types of enemies like cryo or electro. Lastly, I wanted to mention that she does also offer a stamina consumption decrease, which can be very good for charge attacking characters like Kaching or a Hu Tao that doesn't have her first constellation. And if you are C6 with Barbara, she can revive one of your characters, which honestly is pretty useful, but is more of a meme than anything. Whereas overall, the attack she gives you while healing and giving you Hydro application makes her worthy of a mention in this list. Coming in at number 3 on this list is the only character that I've mentioned in my previous video, but that I want to talk about again in this one because they're not only still underrated, but there's also some new things that I want to talk about, especially regarding the specific Abyss rotation. That character is Kaya. I believe Kaya is just pretty amazing as a unit, especially considering the fact that he's just a pretty good 4-star cryo unit at both being a support, a quick swap carry, or just a DPS, and can be very good in freeze teams specifically. Since freeze teams are so prominent and so good in most places, although there are some enemies that it doesn't really work that well against, like a Magu Kenki, which is present in the current Abyss, in general, freeze teams are some of the best in the game, and having someone like Kaya as your main DPS in that is a very good option. Part of the reason why Ayaka is such an amazing unit, and one of the DPSs that I like the most and recommend to a lot of people, is because she's very good in freeze teams, very good at, perma-freezing enemies and dealing a lot of damage. Kaya is the 4-star equivalent of that, the 4-star version of Ayaka, and honestly, while that might not sound that good, it actually kind of is, because Kaya's damage is very high as a cryo unit in many different teams. And even when you can't perma-freeze enemies, a team comp like the reverse melt quick swap that you're seeing on screen will let characters like Kaya and Rosaria, who I'll talk about in a bit, shine by constantly reverse melting that pyro application that Xiangling's doing, dealing massive amounts of damage in a team that isn't even freeze. And then on top of that, against enemies that can be frozen, you can run Kaya on this 4-piece Blizzard Strayer set, which makes him absolutely amazing. Giving 40% crit rate and 15% cryo damage bonus to your Kaya makes him do an insane amount of damage while perma-freezing enemies so they can't move, and being a great carry or quick swap support. His elemental skill having a pretty low cooldown means you can spam it every 6 seconds, and his burst being honestly pretty easy to get back since Kaya gains energy recharge on his ascension stat, and the scaling of this thing is absolutely honestly great. While 132% might not seem that high, you can hit this many times. The exact number depends, but it can be in the double digits if you stay close to enemies, and you can obviously melt it, which makes it a very good ability. I feel like Kaya is someone who people don't really talk about. He's known to be, pretty good, but I would argue he's even better than that. He's definitely one of the strongest 4-star options, especially when you want to run freeze or reverse melt, and he can also be used as a cryo support in teams that need him. Keep in mind though that I will be including 2 additional characters in this list, so it's a top 5 with some honorable mentions at the end, just in case you really wanted like 5 characters that I didn't talk about in the last video. Don't worry, I'm going to include some more at the end that I believe are definitely honorable mentions. Next up, coming in at number 2 is none other than Rosaria. I said I was going to talk about her, so I am. She's just great. It's someone who I've been praising since she came out pretty much. I love her. I think everything about her kit is great, especially as a support, and let me just explain why and why I think she deserves a lot more love than she's currently getting. Rosaria is a character who hasn't been getting that much attention despite amazing scalings on her burst. This skill damage and the Ice Lance damage over time are honestly very good and scale very high with your level. The duration is pretty long, especially if you have her second constellation, which is in my opinion her most important one, increasing the duration of your burst by 4 whole seconds, giving your burst a very long uptime of 12 seconds total on an only 15-second cooldown, which is just amazing. And she is featured in my favorite 4-star team, this reverse melt quick swap one that I already mentioned, but that I'm gonna show footage of just because of how good it is. I honestly want to make a separate video just on this team, but basically having Xiangling to apply pyro constantly, and sometimes Xiangling can melt too, while mainly your cryo characters are the ones reverse melting. Even at lower investment, it still does a ton of damage, and while her cryo application isn't as fast as some other characters like Kaya, she makes up for it with an insane amount of damage and some other features that I'm going to talk about. The main feature actually is that she does give your team a lot of crit rate. As you can see, when she does cast her burst, she will increase the crit rate of all other party members other than Rosaria by 15% of your crit rate. If you can keep your Rosaria's crit rate high, which means just building her on a lot of crit rate, giving her like a crit rate circlet, maybe a crit weapon, you can effectively give your team this whole 15% crit rate, which is absolutely huge, especially when paired with characters that snapshot, which means they keep the buffs for the entire duration of their burst. Someone like Kaya or Xiangling, who are both very good pairs with Rosaria, can utilize this crit rate very well. On top of that, her other passive does increase her own crit rate, which can make it a lot easier for you to transfer this whole 15% crit rate, basically by just giving your Rosaria more so that she can transfer more to your entire team or to like your hyper carry if you are running her with one of those. I think she's just so versatile as a unit, mainly as either a support or just like a quick swap carry, where she's spamming her skill, spamming her burst, swapping out, and then you swap back into her to do the same thing, while she gives crit rate to your whole team and a ton of damage. When you give her 2-piece Noblesse Oblige with 2-piece Blizzard Strayer, she just deals a ton of damage. You can also give her 4-piece Blizzard Strayer in a freeze team, or even something like Emblem is honestly viable to increase her burst damage, and just overall there's many options, and you can effectively deal an insane amount of damage with her while also buffing your other party members. This is why I believe that Rosaria is someone who people don't talk about too much, but she's definitely featured in some of the best 4-star teams in the game, and the fact that these teams and these characters like Rosaria and Kaya aren't talked about that much kind of shows how underrated I believe that they are. The next character I want to talk about is someone who's absolutely broken, and I believe the majority of the community right now has been neglecting this character, or at least not fully understanding how good this character is. This might be a bit of a controversial take, but let me explain myself. I believe Sucrose right now is very underrated. The reason why is because with the release of Kazuha, everyone's been super praising, that character, Kazuha, and myself included. I think Kazuha is very good, but a lot of the things that make Kazuha good, Sucrose can also do. And while Kazuha can be better in many teams, there are some team comps that want Sucrose more, or team comps that only work with Sucrose. On top of that, in general, Sucrose buffs your team a similar amount while offering a lot of things to the table. While this isn't a video meant to compare Sucrose with other Anemo units, the fact that she can even compete and the fact that she is so good and that people neglect her and often put her like 2 tiers below the other Anemo units is just unacceptable in my opinion. While people know that she's strong, I think people don't fully understand how strong she is, so let me explain. First of all, as you might recall, in patch 1.6, elemental reactions or transformative reactions like Swirl did get a buff. That means that characters who can swirl a lot will deal a lot more damage, especially when you stack elemental mastery on them. Sucrose, who can swirl with her normal attacks, her skill, and her burst, can constantly proc swirl, and if you invest into her, can deal massive amounts of damage. On top of that, even at low investment, she's amazing because she can run something like this, the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, buffing your carry by 48%, which, as I mentioned already in this video when talking about Barbara, is just an amazing catalyst for any support. I do want to add though that since Swirl is a transformative reaction, if you want to get the most value out of your Sucrose, you do want to make sure to level her up and stack elemental mastery on her, because that is what Swirl scales off of. If you want your Sucrose to be dealing the most damage, consider running an elemental mastery book that you level to 90 like Sackfrags, but if you want to just be a support and buff your carry's damage, you can run something like Thrilling Tales, which requires a lot less investment. Other than just this though, Sucrose can run the Verdescent Venerer set, reducing the resistance of opponents by 40%, and can also give you an absolute ton of elemental mastery, making her great in reaction teams. This means that she's amazing in teams like the national team or any elemental reaction team because of how much damage she gives your team through her passives, her Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, and the Verdescent Venerer set. And she is obviously a 4-star, meaning her constellations that are honestly pretty good, especially the first few, are very accessible. Lastly, and this is part of the reason why I believe she's underrated, is because of how good some of her teams are. A 4-star team, the Taser comp, is one of the strongest 4-star teams in the game, and what I use to fully 9-star clear the Abyss using only 4-star characters and 4-star weapons. As you can see, this is a team that works because of Sucrose. She isn't really replaceable with someone like Kazuha or Venti in this team because of what your Sucrose is providing. She's on field being the sort of auto attacker, constantly swirling, which if you invest into her deals massive damage, or you can also run her on Thrilling Tales, which you'll lose out on a bit of damage, but you'll buff your Beto, so it kind of makes up for it. But in general, while she's constantly swirling on her normal attacks and her skill and her burst, she's also buffing your team with the Verdescent Venerer and the Elemental Mastery, reducing the resistance of both Electro and Hydro, and since she can constantly auto attack pretty fast while swirling, she enables your Xingqiu's Rainswords to proc, your Beto's Burst to proc, and your Fischl's Oz to constantly deal damage. This team is amazing and doesn't even need a healer because of Xingqiu and Beto offering you damage reduction and your Xingqiu also healing you through his passive. And there are also some other teams where she can be an amazing replacement to basically any other Nemo character like Kazuha or Venti if you don't have them or if you want to use them in your other team. She can be good at displacing enemies, even grouping them with her skill, while also simultaneously buffing your entire team and giving you a ton of particles, especially in like a Shoutout team. Thrilling Tales can be good for the damage, but something like Sackfrags can be very good if you just want to funnel an insane amount of particles to your Anemo carry or what, just your team in general. For those reasons, while I believe that most people think Sucrose is pretty good, I think she's honestly pretty insane and still to this day underrated, which is why I believe it's worth mentioning her and talking about her strengths in this video. Lastly, as a bonus section, there's a few characters that I felt the need to mention in this video, but that couldn't quite make the top 5. And honestly, I was very reluctant within like the last few slots, like number 5 and number 4, who exactly, how to rank them. I think I made a good decision, but I do want to cover some other characters. A character like Mona is someone who I wanted to mention in this list, but Mona is a weird case because I see people both underrating her and overrating her, so it's hard to fully comprehend where exactly people think she is in the meta. Basically, on one hand, she has a few niche team comps, like her teams aren't the most universal thing, but she can have a pretty good hydro application through her skill, her burst, and even auto attacks in certain team comps, enabling reactions like Vaporize. And her main strengths are the immense scaling on her burst, and again, I'm still leveling my Mona. I want to gear her and make a Mona guide eventually, but I just don't have resources right now. But I'll put like the numbers on screen. As you can see, the damage of her bubble gets very high, and on top of that, she also gives a damage bonus to your team. This omen that she can apply to the opponent, giving you a damage bonus, increasing the damage of, you know, your other characters, whatever, is just a very good buff to your team, on top of applying hydro and either dealing a ton of damage with her burst when you gear her on the emblem set, or buffing your whole team by giving her Noblesse Oblige and a Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers. Other than just that, many characters that I mentioned in my previous video, while a lot of them have gotten a lot less underrated, for example, Shangling, I believe a lot of people are picking up how good she is, so she's not a character that I really want to mention, but someone like Beto, I believe, is still not fully appreciated yet because of how good of a carry she is and as a support in many different teams. So that's something I wanted to mention, and she also got a very good new artifact set with Emblem and a pretty good new free-to-play weapon with the Tuna Claymore that I will cover in probably my next video. And lastly, I was initially debating talking about Albedo in this video, but the more I think about it, the less I feel like he's underrated. I just feel like a lot of people either overestimate or underestimate this character, to where I do want to specify some things. Albedo is basically a unit who is very good to have because he can fit most team comps and be a very good replacement to virtually any support. That being said, he doesn't have too many team comps where he's optimal, which is why a lot of people tend to undervalue him. But I do think that especially if you're limited on characters or want to run him in your second team instead of someone else, he can be a very good option because of the solid damage he provides from off field, the elemental mastery his burst does give your team, and the particles that he constantly generates. On top of that, you can run him with something like the tenacity of the Millilith to buff your hyper carries, and he can be the best option in double geo teams, like when you pair him with Shao. He can be a very good support in that team and a good replacement in other teams. I think he is honestly pretty powerful, but very rarely like the best option. And so regarding whether or not he's underrated, I'm honestly not sure, but I feel like it depends on who you ask. And basically, I just want to say that he has some teams where he's optimal, but generally speaking, he's a very good option as a replacement to anyone, or just in a good alternative, like even in Shoutout teams. So I felt like that was worth adding in this video. I tried to choose the characters that, again, through all the tier lists I've seen, the general population, like in my Twitch chat, in comments, all that, characters that aren't talked about enough and that aren't appreciated enough. Obviously, based on who you are and who watches this video, you might have thought some of these characters were really good or really bad. So the definition of underrated really, you know, depends. These are just characters that I believe have a lot of unexplored potential or unadvertised potential. Like, people don't really fully understand how good these characters are, even if they're not all like the best characters. For example, someone like Barbara is very underrated, but still isn't like the best character in the game. Obviously not. And I know in this video I mentioned a lot of cryo characters, but honestly, each of the individual characters, like not just the element, are very underrated. Cryo is not only an amazing element, but each of the individual characters I named have very good kits, very good utility, and are quite flexible in many different teams, which is why I felt the need to talk about them, honestly. And for more variety, I did include some honorable mentions in the last section. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed the video. I tried to cover new characters from my last one because a lot has changed since then, especially with like the 1.6 swirl or reaction buffs and new abyss, all that stuff. And I hope this video was helpful. As I mentioned in my last video, I do plan on making a new Beto guide with the new Claymore and artifact set, and a Mona guide once I do finish leveling her and fully testing everything about her. So yeah, stay tuned for those guys. And with that being said, I hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to follow me on Twitch, subscribe if you're new, all that stuff. Leave a like if it helped you out. And with that being said, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.